I think that at the end of the day, like people are, they use democracy as a stand-in for good, and that's not good. I mean, there are plenty of countries that are democracies. Doesn't mean they're have a wonderful system of government.
Yep.
And when you hear the term democracy thrown around, like no one thinks about the bad parts of democracy. Like, by the way, like, do you think Jim Crow laws were supported by democratic institutions or not? They absolutely were supported by democratic institutions run by fucking bigots.
Yep.
So like
Hmm.
the democracy is not a stand-in for the word good, and that's where we need to challenge ourselves. Like, is to understand like it's not all about the will of the people, right? Like, did you guys know that senators used to be appointed by governors? They weren't popularly elected.
I did
I
not know
didn't
that.
know that. Didn't
Yeah,
know that.
yeah, yeah. Do you know why that was the case?
Because it was more efficient for a governor to just pick a senator.
No, because it represented states' interests. That's why we have a Senate and a House. There's the will
Right.
of the people and the will of the states, right?
Hmm.
Ah,
Yeah.
The fact you
Makes
don't know
sense.
that scares me, but like,
I
you
No, I mean,
should know
I
that.
know, I know the reasoning behind it. Like with
Yeah.
the what's that thing called? The Constitution. Why that's important because you don't necessarily want the majority just voting for certain things that another state may. And it was a compromise, right? I forgot what the damn. I keep forgetting right now what the exact thing was, but yeah, it was a compromise between states' rights versus
federal.
federal rights, right? Where the federal government could just legislate and dictate, and the states would just have to go with it. So even like right now with the abortion debate that's out there, the debate isn't necessarily should we have the right, should people have the right to have an abortion or not. It's whether the states get to make the rules on whether people can have the abort. That's what the argument was eventually heard with the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court said no, it's the states' right to make that judgment, not the federal government's right. If the federal government wants to do it and they want to enact the law, they need to go through the process of actually having an amendment go through the Constitution and codify that into law, saying that across these lands. That's why you don't have. That's why you have the slavery, right? Where slavery was abolished because it was done on a federal level. So no state, right? Even if your state right now has laws allowing you to have slaves, it gets completely muted out
Are you
because
talking
of the
about
amendment process.
incorporation?
Yeah.
Like incorporation of the Bill of Rights happened. I think it was the 14th Amendment. But
Yeah.
like the point I was trying to make there is like Randy Barnett wrote this book, and he was like, the Constitution as written is a better form of government than the one we actually have, and our form of government has gone through numerous iterations, not the least of which have been Supreme Court ruling after Supreme Court ruling that forms this other branch of government that isn't accounted for. But like the point I was trying to make with why we're state, like why we're senators appointed by governors, was because there needed to be a balance between the will of the people and the will of the state. And that is very important to preserve that. And when you get too much democracy, you get a lot of stupidity. And like turning the Senate into also the people's house was probably one of the worst decisions our country has ever made, you know, and not being able to balance state interests with the will of the popular. And by the way, like, why do we have an electoral college? Like, we have an electoral college because we have gazillion states in this. We have 50 fucking states in this country, over 300 million people. And we need to make sure that Idaho and South Dakota are actually represented on the same level as California and New York. Now,
Yep.
you want to tear that republic apart, that's on you, but that could lead to civil war. Like, there's an old saying, aim for peace, not being right, you know? Like, that's why we have an electoral college, is like to aim for peace, not being right. So like there are
Right.
all these things that like come into play when you're designing a system of government that are required for you to think about, and that guys, almost 300 years ago had a better knowledge of, and um, actually were critically thinking about compared to Twitter, you know. And I think a lot of people should go back and start reading Montesquieu and reading like the original philosophies that informed our founders, so they can actually have an informed opinion about like why we're here, how did we get here, why did we get here. But if we don't, if we're going to be fucking morons about it and start like, retweeting everyone's posts, we're going to lose it. It's going to go away because it's going to be the quickest path to tyranny, which is I had a koozie. I don't know where it's at, but I still probably have it somewhere. It says never underestimate the power of stupid people in large groups. You know.
Do you have a few minutes, Coach Trap? I'm just gonna show you guys a video real quick that
Sure.
yeah.
As long as it's not another fucking video game
Thank you,
thing.
Mr. Chairman.
Because the
members of
audience got
committee.
pissed on that last one.
No.
I'm happy to be back in front of the Judiciary Committee where I started this pilgrimage. I am going to get even more fundamental than my good friend and colleague. Like him, I speak to students, especially law students, but also college students and even high school students, quite frequently about the Constitution, because I feel that we're not teaching it very well. I speak to law students from the best law schools, people presumably especially interested in the law, and I ask them, how many of you have read the Federalist Papers? And well, a lot of hands will go out. No, not just number 48 and the big ones. How many of you have read the Federalist Papers, cover to cover? Never more than about 5%. And that is very sad. I mean, especially if you're interested in the Constitution. Here's a document that says what the framers of it thought they were doing. It's such a profound exposition of political science that it is studied in political science courses in Europe. And yet we have raised a generation of Americans who are not familiar with it. So when I speak to these groups, the first point I make, and I think it's even a little more fundamental than the one that Stephen has just put forward, I ask them, what do you think is the reason that America is such a free country? What is it in our Constitution that makes us what we are? And I guarantee you that the response I will get, and you will get this from almost any American, including the woman that he was talking to at the supermarket, the answer would be freedom of speech, freedom of the press, no unreasonable searches and seizures, no quartering of troops in hope, those marvelous provisions of the Bill of Rights. But then I tell them, if you think that a Bill of Rights is what sets us apart, you're crazy. Every banana republic in the world has a Bill of Rights. Every president for life has a Bill of Rights. The Bill of Rights of the former evil empire, the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, was much better than ours. I mean it literally. It was much better. We guarantee freedom of speech and of the press, big deal. They guaranteed freedom of the speech, of the press, of street demonstrations and protests, and anyone who is caught trying to suppress criticism of the government will be called to account. Whoa, that is wonderful stuff. Of course, just words on paper, what our framers would have called a parchment guarantee. And the reason is that the real constitution of the Soviet Union, you think of the word constitution, it doesn't mean a bill, it means structure. Say a person has a sound constitution, has a sound structure. The real constitution of the Soviet Union, which is what our framers debated that whole summer in Philadelphia in 1787. They didn't talk about the Bill of Rights. That was an afterthought, wasn't it? That constitution of the Soviet Union did not prevent the centralization of power in one person or in one party. And when that happens, the game is over. The Bill of Rights is just what our framers would call a parchment guarantee. So the real key to
Can you pause it there?
the distinctiveness of America.
So that point on single party rule is 100% correct, right? Like, and that's the thing, like living in other countries where I got to be very familiar with the effects of that is like, once you have a single party system, once you have no real robust political debate happening, that's when all those things that he's talking about in there, all the you could have as many guarantees in the Constitution as you want. It's not going to matter, you know? And we should really look at that. Like, I live in California, right? That is a one party state. There is no robust debate that happens, none of that. And I can see those same dynamics that I would see happening in corrupt countries happening here, which is like, we're not going to listen to the courts. we're not going to listen to the law. We're going to do what we want to do because we're California and we're awesome. We have the moral authority to do what we want to do, regardless of what the law says or the rules of the republic are, right?
Yeah.
So I would say like the thing that is most threatening in most of these scenarios is not just the concentration of political power into one individual, but concentration of political power into a single party system. The other side of that is the populace who votes for that, right? So like, you know, who here has heard the saying "never again," right? Like never again. That was after World War II. Never again would we allow ourselves to commit mass genocide. Well, mass genocide has happened innumerable times since World War II. But they all have one thing in common, which is a populace intent on carrying it out. And it wasn't Adolf Hitler that caused mass genocide. It was the people who would listen to that motherfucker. It's us. The real lesson of World War II is that every genocidal maniac exists in all of us. And our willingness to listen to that crap is what's at stake. And I look to things like the Stanford prison experiments to point out to people like the real threat is not the Adolf Hitler, it's you, you know. And that is really where Scalia is going with this, in my opinion. Is like we have to prevent stupidity and people's worst instincts. Because remember, we are animals closely related to primates. Did you know that primates will murder an alpha male that's perceived to be unjust? No, unjust.
Really?
Like, yes, 100%. Jonathan Haidt talks about this in his research. Primates will murder an alpha male that is perceived to be unjustly carrying out his role. It's kind of crazy when you think about it at the end of the day. Yeah. But like it's ingrained in us to have a sense of justice, you know. But at the same time, it's also ingrained in us to have a sense of bloodlust. And I think like we can be easily manipulated, and that's the real lesson of World War II. Is like we really have to do better as individuals to hold ourselves to higher standards, you know, and especially if you grew up in America, especially if you're growing up in the West, do not let yourselves vote for a single party. If your political I always ask my friend this one time before I got off Facebook. I was asking him on Facebook. I was like, do you vote your ideology every time? Like, do you always just vote your ideology? Does everything you say align with some party? Like, maybe it shouldn't, bro, because like every worst thing in history, that's how people were doing things, you know?
Yeah.
It's like everything you believed aligned, like 100%. Like, if you have nothing questioning this party over here, this ideology, like that's scary, you know?
So it's kind of cool because let me just finish playing it because he actually goes into how the U.S. prevents that from happening. It's really interesting. Hold on one second.
I'm really curious how in 2022. So this is like clearly like 98 or 2000, 22 years later. If this whole
structure of our government, one part of it, of course, is the independence of the judiciary. But there's a lot more. There are very few countries in the world, for example, that have a bicameral legislature. Oh, England has a House of Lords for the time being, but the House of Lords has no substantial power. They can just make the Commons pass a bill a second time. France has a Senate, it's honorific. Italy has a Senate, it's honorific. Very few countries have two separate bodies in the legislature equally powerful. That's a lot of trouble, as you gentlemen doubtless know, to get the same language through two different bodies elected in a different fashion. Very few countries in the world have a separately elected chief executive. Sometimes I go to Europe to talk about separation of powers. And when I get there, I find that all I'm talking about is independence of the judiciary, because the Europeans don't even try to divide the two political powers, the two political branches, the legislature and the chief executive. In all of the parliamentary countries, the chief executive is the creature of the legislature. There's never any disagreement between them and the prime minister, as there is sometimes between you and the president. When there's a disagreement, they just kick him out. They have a no confidence vote, a new election, and they get a prime minister who agrees with the legislature. And, you know, the Europeans look at this system and they say, well, It passes one house, it doesn't pass the other house. Sometimes the other house is in the control of a different party. It passes both, and then this president who has a veto power vetoes it, and they look at this and they say, it is gridlock. And I hear Americans saying this nowadays, and there's a lot of it going around. They talk about a dysfunctional government because there's disagreement, and the framers would have said, yes, that's exactly the way we set it up. We wanted this to be power, contradicting power, because the main ill that beset us, as Hamilton said in the Federalist, when he talked about a separate Senate. He said, yes, it seems inconvenient, but inasmuch as the main ill that besets us is an excess of legislation, it won't be so bad. This is 1787. He didn't know what an excess of legislation was. So unless Americans can appreciate that and learn to love the separation of powers, which means learning to love the gridlock, which the framers believed would be the main protection of minorities. The main protection. If a bill is about to pass that really comes down hard on some minority, they think it's terribly unfair. It doesn't take much to throw a monkey wrench into this complex system. So Americans should appreciate that, and they should learn to love the gridlock. It's there for a reason, so that the legislation that gets out will be good legislation. And thus conclude.
So it's kind of sad. Yeah, it's kind of sad. It's kind of sad because everything that he said is 100% right. But over the last 20 years, we've started to erode that. And the way that we started doing it is confirmations, right? And then passing certain laws with just a simple majority.
I can give you the counter argument to Scalia, but the point is like what's interesting about Palantir is it draws us into these conversations, right? Like, why? Because Palantir is at the nexus of a lot of these things. They're at the nexus of civil liberties, of war, of empowering governments. It's pretty crazy when you think about it.
That's why it's such an interesting company to cover, because I did debate in high school.
Right.
I was a national debater, and literally I had
like the moment you launch a Palantir channel, you're going to be in the intersection of all these things.
Of all these debates.